Daniel and I are artists in our own right, and we thought we were being invited to the boiler room and we were going to DJ, but I guess we missed that one. So we're going to sit down and talk. So really interesting, and really enjoyed coming to TOA last year and being here, and giving me the opportunity and continuing the opportunity to, this conference and a lot of conferences are about talking about the future. And sometimes you don't get a chance to reflect or really explore how you got there. And so I thought I would talk to Daniel, who I have to, confess that I know him. So so it's not the first time we're meeting, and we've developed a relationship. And we often have conversations, and like all relationships, you peel back the onion, you learn a little bit at a time. So I thought that you had an eye on the future, but I'd like to explore how you got there, and from my understanding, I'll do a little recap, and then I want to discuss that. Clearly, people know Daniel for having done a lot of things, through his label and for other artists, but he really started as an artist in his own right, and he became a businessman, and he's kind of back to basics, so he's kind of run full circle. So I'd like to kind of know, how he got there, because it's important to know the history. So digging a little bit, and actually just recently you told me, I kept wondering, what is your relationship to Germany? And then you told me you were born in Austria. So can you speak a little bit about your Austrian roots, and then? Well,
actually, I wasn't born in Austria. I was born in London, but my parents were Austrian. They came as refugees in the late 30s. They came to the UK, and I was born in London, but obviously grew up very much in an Anglo-Austrian kind of, environment. Both my parents were actors, and they had to learn the language when they had to leave Austria because of the Anschluss, because of when Hitler came, and they both had to learn, but they had very fruitful careers, fortunately back in the UK. So I grew up in a home where mostly when I was talking to my parents, English was spoken. But when their other friends came around, there was a lot of German spoken, and it felt like a dual. I grew up in this kind of very mixed environment, and I suppose without thinking too much, that kind of I really absorbed that into my kind of cultural upbringing.
So going to school in the UK, you studied film and TV, so kind of always gravitated towards the arts. Mm-hmm. Can you speak about that? And then, was it during or after you then had already you were DJing before a lot of us ever thought of the concept of DJing? I'd love to hear more about those years coming out of school, during school, and going into your becoming an artist.
Well, I was always, from a very, very young age. I grew up in the 60s in the UK, which was like an amazing time for music. It was like, when the Beatles came along, the Stones, and in America, there was the Beach Boys. And all that happened around when I was around 10 or 11. And I really fell into music completely. I was completely taken by music. And I was in bands at school, playing guitar really badly. All the bands kind of gravitated towards the quality of musicians, so all the best musicians were in one band, all the worst musicians. I was in the worst musicians. But I always wanted to be able to express myself musically, which is something I found a little bit frustrating because I really couldn't play very well. And then I also was very into photography and filmmaking as a kid, with Super 8. And I ended up going to, I guess my first love was music, but I couldn't find a way that I could be involved with music as a kind of career or whatever. So I ended up studying film and TV. And worked, and then I worked as an assistant film editor for a while. Then I traveled around Europe and ended up in a ski resort in Switzerland called the Zermatt. And I thought, this is a nice place. I might want to hang out here for a while. So I applied for a job at the club. There was just like one club really, as a DJ. I'd never DJed before in my life. And they said, oh, well, try out. And I had a few records. I didn't have any records with me. They had a few records there. I just played, and they said, okay, well, you can when you come back, we'll either give you the job as a DJ or the code check, depending on if the DJ comes back or not. So I turned up in Zermatt a few months later. The DJ didn't turn up, so I was there DJing. And those days it was 7 inches, and it was very much like a holiday resort, so it was very much like whatever the chart hits were at the time, and this was just pre-disco. was quite a lot of funk, but I also played things like Deep Purple and Status Quo, and just whatever was in the ABBA.
As gets done in a resort, or whatever the crowd.
I guess I learned quite a lot from it, because I didn't dislike it. I wasn't into the music really that much, but I was very into making it work. And I think that informed some of the things that came later. But I just did 2 seasons there. I didn't take it up as a profession after that.
I run into this a lot with nothing has really changed in many regards, in that if you like music, you got to do a lot of this and that. So it sounds like nothing changed. I think the equipment's better now, but you kind of, from day one that I met you and knowing a little bit about yourself, I bought the first normal single. I'm old enough to have been DJing at the time, and that kind of blew my mind. And then a few years later, Mute started. But you're always fascinated with gadgets and toys. Can you maybe elaborate about some of your favorite gateway technology toys that?
Well, I mean, my gateway to technology really was through the music, first of all. I was really, around the beginning of the 70s, when a lot of the German artists started coming through, like Can and Neu and Kraftwerk and Faust and Tangerine Dream, and those kind of artists using a lot of electronic instruments. And that was my gateway into electronic. I kind of got obsessed with how electronics could change music. And as the time went on, at a certain point, punk happened in whoops, there's a fight going on, that's good. Punk happened in 1976. Around that time, cheaper synthesizers came onto the market and recording equipment, and the whole DIY movement started. So that was I felt somehow I'd landed at a point where I could get involved with music and making music. And I bought a cheap synth, a Korg 700S, and a cheap tape recorder, a TX 2340. And then I just started making music, literally in my bedroom. And I got to a point with this really great, simple synth, the 700S, and I got to a point where I thought, actually, I'm enjoying this, and I'm actually being able to, for the first time in my life, kind of transfer my ideas onto tape. And so I thought I'd make a single and put it out myself, because the whole, as I said, the DIY 7-inch movement was growing, and I thought I'd do it. And I felt that electronic music was the future of music. And up till then, there had been some very interesting things, like the artists that I mentioned before. And then there was a lot of the way synthesizers were used in other ways, kind of pseudo-classical kind of things, which I really hated. But at that point, it was fairly elitist. To own a synthesizer was like it was difficult. It was very expensive, but I wanted to try and push the anti-elitist aspect of it that was coming with the cheaper synthesizers and so forth, and that actually it was really a punk instrument. That was my thing. I was really into punk, and I was really into electronic music. And I thought, actually, a synthesizer is the ultimate punk instrument, because you don't even have to play one chord. You can just press a note, press a key, and you get a sound. So I thought, that was kind of that was what the kind of theory I had behind it. And I put out this, and I released a single which I thought nobody would buy, because nobody was really making electronic music at that time or releasing it. But then but people seemed to like it. I couldn't believe it, and it got good reviews. And then I realized, realized there were other people doing this as well. So just around the same time as I released my single, the Human League released their first single, Cabaret Voltaire, Throbbing Gristle, Robert Rental, Thomas Lear, and all of a sudden there was, just in 1978, it was a special moment. All this new music was coming out. It was a very exciting period.
Yeah, amazing that you touch upon DIY, because I think after you do a bit of this and that, and you keep peeling things back, you realize, I got to take the next step, And now it's a great template. And it's funny how we've evolved, because I think a lot of that evolution still kind of works, or I would recommend it, and I also we see it today.
Yeah. I mean, people are making music in their bedrooms.
Yeah, that's right. And then
on their
release
computers.
it. It's easier now. I mean, so you were
It's
working
easier
at,
and it's more difficult.
True. I mean, things change. So, in each generation, we all lament when you're young at each stage of life, but then each stage, man, it's really tough now. Things were easier then. Well, I don't know if they were easier then. There was no sync, there was no nothing.
It was easier and more difficult. It was easier because there were relatively very few DIY records around, and there was a lot of interest in them. So to get, I mean, and the world, as you know, there was no marketing. There were like 4 publications in the UK, and one DJ, the legendary John Peel, who was supporting it. And through that very minimal kind of number of outlets, you got to a lot of people, because those music papers were national and very popular. Now, you can get to the world through lots of different platforms straight from your bedroom, but you're up there with millions and millions of other tracks. So how you push your head above, above the noise is much, much more difficult than it was then. So it's a bit of a, pros and cons.
So you finally get to this point, and this is the really tough point for creative people. You start off and you're creative and you want to express yourself, and you finally find a way to express yourself, because arguably a lot of the kind of pioneers I find have dabbled in music to some degree. I actually learned to play guitar, and when people ask me, what instrument do you play? I'm like, oh, I learned guitar, but I don't play it. I learned to express myself digitally. So you finally found a way to express yourself, and you want to take the next step. So I think this is the dilemma of an artist. And so I'd love if you can, recall that moment. You've learned, you've cut, you cut your teeth. You were working at Rough Trade at the time, or
no?
Was that after?
No, I wasn't working. I started after I went to Rough Trade with my test pressing of my 7-inch. I didn't know the people there. I thought they would buy a box or 25 or something, and they said they liked it so much they wanted to distribute it for me.
Wow.
And so then I got to know the people there, and I used to help out with the label a little bit. Yeah,
but here's the dilemma of an artist.
Okay.
You're finally starting to blossom as a creative person.
Yeah.
And did you not want someone else to license your record and put it out? So some people have gone to start their own labels. I kind of went down that path, and then with Rich Houghton, a lot of people. Yeah. Others are like, meet someone like, I want to be an artist. I want to be creative and not do all this pressing and manufacturing and distributing. Was it a real torturous decision for you, or is that just the way you were going to do it? Or was there a different time then? Was the zeitgeist a little different?
First of all, I had no interest in working in the music industry at all, as it stood at the time.
Famous last words.
And I still don't really like the music industry very much. I like working with artists and promoting their music. But and I never really thought of myself as like an artist in the sense of like wanting to have a career at making music. Okay, there was a particular thing I wanted to express, which I did with that first single. I did a couple of other things, but what I found out, and I really liked the process of I liked all that stuff, going to the sleeve printer, going to the pressing plant, listening to the test pressings, putting the records in the back of my car, taking them to Rough Trade for distribution. I liked that kind of physical aspect of it very, very much. And, and when about a year or so after I released the first single, I started working with another artist called Fad Gadget, who made some incredible records. And I realized that what I really enjoyed was working with other artists, helping them in the studio. I just kind of drifted towards that kind of thing rather than making my own music. Maybe I was a cop-out, a creative cop-out, but I actually enjoyed working with other artists, and that's kind of where it went after that, as it goes today.
No, I certainly, you're too maybe self-deprecating. I think that music now is often we have a different concept of what a producer was.
Yeah.
When I started and I wanted to participate in the music business, I wanted to produce an album with other people. So I think that's cool, that creative sort of crucible with others, because otherwise it's always from your own mind, and some artists work well with that, but I think it's perfectly cool to be a producer with people as part of the...
I mean, producer has kind of two meanings now. Like, there's the traditional sense of a producer, the kind of thing I'm talking about. You go into a studio with a band, with an artist, and you make a record. More recently, when people talk about producers, it's more about people making their own music. It's usually electronic music, making their own music under their own name. So it's kind of an artist producer. It's kind of a slightly different thing, but it's all about, in the end, it's about making music. But
so you decided to start your label, and a lot of us know to some degree that the label, had some legs and quite a history to it. I'd like to maybe hear how clearly you covered the world. Your label, penetrated the world and laid the foundation for just about a lot of electronic artists and other labels. Let's speak, since we're here in Berlin. How did Berlin start to factor? Because you've got a long history in Berlin. I'd love to know how it started. Did it come gangbusters or whatever? Just can you speak to that a little bit and how?
Sure. Well, I've been to Berlin a couple of times with artists just for their gigs in the early days, like 80, 81. But the engagement really started. I started to work with the Birthday Party, who shortly split up, and that was Nick Cave's group. And now, since then, he's had an incredible career as Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. But they were living in Berlin at the time, and I came because they were recording in a studio called Hansa Studios, which is an incredible studio, or still is to a certain extent an incredible studio. It was right by the wall. Of course, the Berlin Wall was still up then. This was 82 or 83, I think. And it was a crazy time in Berlin, and it was a crazy time with the Birthday Party. But I kind of fell in love with Berlin, and I fell in love with that studio. Because, first of all, it had a really great combination. There was Studio 2, which was a huge hall, which was an amazing live room. And then it had the mix room, which was like super high-tech, completely modern high-tech studios. This kind of combination of really old-school things and high-tech. And it was a beautiful building, and it was in Berlin. And because of the nature of things at the time, it was cheaper to record in Berlin than it was in London, quite a lot cheaper. Even, to stay in Berlin and to record in one of the best studios in the world was cheaper than recording in an average studio in London. So you put all those things together. And anyway, I was there with Nick, with the Birthday Party at Hansa Studios. At the same time, just before that, I'd started recording Depeche Mode's third album, Construction Time Again, and we were taking a break. And we were working with an engineer called Gareth Jones, and he'd just moved to Berlin as well, and he showed me around the studio and convinced me that we should finish the album there at Hansa. And I said, yeah, it sounds like a good idea, let's do it. The band were totally into it. And really, that was the beginning of a very long relationship with Berlin. We made 3 more albums there with Depeche. I also worked there with Fad Gadget, who I mentioned before, Nights Arab, Diamanda Gallis, Einstürzen and Neubauten, many other artists. We worked in that legendary studio, and it was fantastic. There's a really good documentary film about it, actually, if anybody's really that interested, but it's a really interesting documentary.
And what's that?
Sorry?
What's the film?
I think it's just called Hansa. If you just Google Hansa Studio documentary.
Definitely.
Because it was made famous originally by David Bowie, who did his Low and Heroes. And then, when we were there for a long time, then U2 recorded there, and all sorts of people. So that was great. And then, of course, the techno scene towards the end of the 80s, the techno scene was starting to grow in Berlin. And then the wall came down, and all these kind of clubs in semi-legal venues opened up, like Tresor and Planet and all those, and a lot of really great clubs, because there were a lot of buildings in Berlin at the time. Just after the wall came down, the Berlin government decided to give those buildings back to the original owners before the war, who they'd been taken off before the war. But they couldn't find a lot of those original owners for whatever reason. So a lot of those buildings remained empty, but I think they were quite happy for those buildings to be used for a constructive purpose, so they weren't just sort of going to ruin. And so all these clubs and bars opened up in these semi-derelict buildings, and it was an incredible time. And then and there was a very good convention at that time called Berlin Independence Days, which is where I first met John.
That's right. We attended that. It was our first visit to Berlin.
Yeah, and you had a +8 party.
Yeah.
And I remember everybody saying, you've got to go to the +8 party. You've got to go to the +8 party. And that's right. And Berlin Independence Days, it started out more like an indie thing, but by 89, 90, it became purely like electronic music, really. And then, yeah, and then we started Nova Mute to reflect that, because it was music that we really enjoyed, and we had a relationship with Tresor as well, where we released their records outside of Germany. So we would, and since then, I've been living here. I mean, I live here half the time now. I've been, so it's a city I love. Of course, it's changed. Like every big city, it's changed, but because of the nature of the history of the city, it's changed even more. But I still find it, it's a great place to be and a great place to live, yeah. Well, compared to London, it's like coming to the countryside, it's really...
Well, we were like honored and awed when we first met. Still to this day, this guy had a pretty big label, and I meet him and he's loving techno music. I'm like, you like techno music? I mean, well, clearly, kept evolving then as we stayed in touch. I'm launching Nova Mute, but what about Mute? Well, yeah, I'm doing that, but I also have this passion for electronic music. I'm like, wow, that's just amazing. Like, thanks for staying in touch. So we had the opportunity to do a lot of work together, and I also had that. But Mute took off. Not only are you running a very big inspirational label, but you got time to do stuff that you're inspired. So can you speak to, how did you manage to, remain an artist and be creative? Clearly, I saw at least one facet when we first met, that this man had time to do a techno label while managing a much bigger label. So were you playing much, or just kind of studio? You were releasing.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't.
How did you? And what were you doing?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wasn't. I was by 19. By then, by the time I started Nova Mute, I'd stopped producing as well, and stopped playing, and I was really running the label, but doing what is known as A&R, which is a very kind of fuzzy term, but what it means really is going into the studio, helping out where necessary. I kind of there at the beginning of the process with the songs or with the ideas, maybe finding a producer, then letting people get on with it, then I just check in from time to time, and then I'm there at the end for the mixing, where people tend to get like, you hear, there's a point where you need fresh ears, and that's where I like to get involved as well. But I mean, the thing about doing all these things, I mean, I wasn't doing them on my own. I still have a great bunch of people around me. There was a guy who you know very well, Seth Hodder, and a woman called Peppy Jantz. They ran Nova Mute, and they were very much into the scene at that time, and they did an amazing job. And they worked with Richie Hawtin, Plastic Man at the beginning, Speedy J, Luke Slater, Chris Liebing, goes on and on and on. So with some of the most important producers and artists and DJs who are still incredibly strong today. So I was talking to somebody about techno DJs and in general, and they said they're kind of like jazz musicians. People, you don't have to be good looking or anything to be a techno DJ. It's not about presenting a beautiful visual image. I mean, nothing wrong with an interesting image, but it's not about that. It's not like EDM where you have to be like a pop star. And it's more like, the more you do it, the more people respect you, and you're getting more mature, and it's like a jazz thing, which I think is nice. Well, I like that comparison, especially as I'm getting on a bit, and
Well, again, kind of glossing over the business bit. So you sold Mute, and I met Sonar. I can't remember what year. I'm guessing 4 or 5 years ago, and Daniel Miller's DJing. And he's playing on the terrace of the Sonar by day. And I was like, wow, Daniel Miller's DJing. First time I heard Daniel DJ. I knew he liked it, but I mean, I saw him, play for a crowd. And I was like, man, Daniel's awesome. So all of a sudden, you kind of recalibrated, and you're DJing. And I've also had the pleasure, I got to join him. This guy's like a regular at Berghain. I got a chance to play with you. So here you are DJing. You recalibrated, got a different balance. So it sounds like you're more artist heavy. And so talk about, clearly you seem to remain invigorated by that. And can you talk about your artist career and schedule? And
it's a DJ career, really. Anyway, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really DJ in the classic sense of the word since those days in the early 70s in Switzerland. But a friend of mine, Carl O'Connor, who's known as Regis, who's a great techno DJ, he had a party at Berghain about 6 or 7 years ago. And he said, come on, he's got a very strong Birmingham accent. I'm not going to attempt to do it. He said, come on, you can play. Come and join us. So you must be joking. He said, no, you can do it. You know, we'll give you the opening slots. Be relaxed, be chilled. So I played at Berghain for the first, it was really my first techno DJ set. It's like playing football, your first football match at Wembley Stadium or something. Yeah. And I actually really got a buzz out. I really, really enjoyed it. And so I decided to carry on and do I mean, I'm not a full-time DJ by any sense of the word, but I really enjoy it. I do about 20 gigs a year, and I'm really, really enjoying it. And we started up Nova Mute again last year. The original incarnation kind of went to sleep in the it was around 2005, I think, something like that, I can't remember. But I decided to start it up again because I was DJing, I was connecting with a lot of other DJs and producers, and I was kind of knew what I liked, and I think that's really important. And so I thought we'll start it up again, and we've had 4 releases so far, 5 releases. Just the 5th one's just coming out, and we do Nova Mute nights. We do Nova Mute parties. We did one at Berghain a few weeks ago. We did one off Sonar last week. Next one's in Budapest. Yeah, and I'm really enjoying it. And it's really, I like the culture. I like the people around techno. It feels like really open-minded and very friendly and not too competitive. Maybe it's just the way I see it, but it doesn't feel like that. It just feels like everybody's in it together. It's like we're in a cause together, trying to push things forward.
Well, I certainly can't debate that. I think a lot of us are lifers in electronic music, and the techno certainly carries that torch. And if you want to be a lifer, I think you still have to have that DIY and do everything you have to. Yeah. So I think that techno ethos of playing a little bit improves the A&Ring and improves everything. And so I think we're richer for it. That people like Daniel are still so passionate. And if you get a chance to check him out, I think you should. I think there's a lot. The last couple of minutes, I'd like to cover not just the DJing, but you spoke to. I was going to jump in earlier when you were talking about you were doing some, Super 8 movies and stuff. Where can we see some of your other work as an artist? I don't know if you've saved any of the old stuff, but also you're pretty active photography. Like the classic overachiever, just when you think he's busy having done this and this, there's even more sides to the, the man. So can you just speak and
I love photography. I'm really into street photography, and I'm an amateur photographer. I enjoy it. I'm okay. I'm not great. But I really enjoy it, and I don't put much stuff online, actually, because I don't know, I just don't, I'm not really, I think, I'm happy with it, then I'll do something with it. But if any of you are going to be in Vienna in a couple of weeks, one of the bands I work with, Leibach, they played in North Korea recently, well, a couple of years ago now, the first Western band to play in North Korea. And I was fortunate enough to join them, and I kind of was one of the people documenting it. And there's an exhibition in Vienna, it's next week, actually. The opening's in next week. So if any of you are around, it's open for a while, you should check it out.
Well, that's great. Happy to be able to kind of keep our conversation going and share it with everyone. And just very inspiring. And keep going, Daniel. Don't stop.
Thank you, John. Same
really.
to you, man.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a bit of a Q&A. I'm Nico, by the way. Thank you very much for doing this, Daniel and John. Hi. So you see the questions up here. You want to pick any that you fancy? Is the guitar era dead?
Is the guitar era dead? I think the guitar era is going through a difficult time for various reasons. I mean, I think for purely practical reasons, if you want to, generally speaking, guitarists, if you're in a guitar band, you have to have somewhere to rehearse, which is getting more and more expensive and difficult in the urban environment. You have to have a van or something to carry your stuff around. I think electronic music is ubiquitous now in all its different forms. It's more practical to make it. You can, as I said, you can do it in your bedroom and upload it. So I would never say the guitar era is dead. I'm not a huge fan of the guitar era, but there's some great music made with guitars still, so I'm not, yeah.
How about your favorite artist of 2018?
Well, I mean, of course, my favorite artists, or the ones I'm most familiar with, are the ones I work with. And I would never pick one single one out, but I mean, there are a number of artists who are doing releases on Mute at the moment. On the Nova Mute side is Nicholas Bugayev, Charlotte de Witte, Anna, Terence Fixmer. On the records, on the Mute side is Chris Liebing, Daniel Bloomberg, Lost Under Heaven. I mean, I'm never going to pick out my favorites.
If you had to pick one that's not working with you currently?
Oh, that's not working with me. Okay, that's interesting.
I think the question there, just for the last one, Daniel, you spoke to this. How relevant are labels? Because things were different then and now. How relevant today are labels
That's a good.
for artists with all the tools and promotion at hand?
I mean, I think there is a relevance for labels for certain artists. A lot of artists don't need labels. But a lot of artists like that collaboration, and they just really want to focus on the art and not have to worry about all the other stuff. Labels have a role today in the industry, but then you know, they're totally relevant for the people who need that, and they're irrelevant for the people who don't.
Great, very good.
Perfect. Thank you very much, guys. Daniel, John, thanks.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks.